My wife died and left me only an old coat, and I never imagined that sentence would define the final chapter of my life. At the inheritance reading in Cuyahoga County, I stood in silence while my son-in-law smiled like he already owned everything my wife ever built. Daniel Whitmore leaned back in his chair and said out loud that the $8 million was already his, as if my grief was irrelevant. The lawyer cleared his throat and placed the sealed documents on the table, but Daniel didn't even bother to look at me when he spoke. People in that room were not waiting for truth. They were waiting for confirmation that I had finally been pushed out of my own life. Then the lawyer lifted the coat my wife left behind, a simple old garment folded carefully, and something about the room changed instantly. Because inside that coat, hidden in silence and stitching, was something no one in that courtroom was prepared to face. Only if this story speaks to your heart. Take a moment to like and subscribe to this channel, and let me know in the comments where you are watching from in the world and what time it is right now in your city, because I want to know how far this story is traveling while it is being told, and stay with me until the end. Only if this story truly resonates with you, because what you are about to hear is not just about inheritance, but about truth buried where no one thought to look. My name is Michael Harrison. I am 72 years old, and what happened in that courtroom was not just the reading of a will. It was the moment I realized my entire family had already decided who I was long before my wife took her last breath. And that night in Cleveland, Ohio, everything I believed about loyalty, love, and legacy began to break apart in ways I did not see coming. And if there is one lesson hidden inside this story, it is that silence in a family is never empty. It is always full of something waiting to be revealed. And now let me take you back to where it truly began. The courthouse in Cuyahoga County smelled like old paper and polished wood, the kind of place where time feels slowed down by bureaucracy and regret. And I remember standing near the back of the probate room watching Daniel Whitmore move through the space like he belonged there more than anyone else, shaking hands, speaking quietly, nodding at the lawyer as if he had already been briefed on every outcome, while I stood there holding nothing but the weight of my wife Laura's absence. Laura had been gone for only a few weeks, and yet the house already felt like it had been reassigned without my permission, like even grief required approval from people who no longer respected me. Daniel turned slightly toward me at one point and gave a small smile, the kind of smile that does not ask a question, it delivers an answer, and he said, "It's going to be simpler this way, Michael, trust me." And I remember hearing those words not as comfort, but as ownership, as if simplicity was something he had already negotiated on my behalf. Emily, my daughter, stood near him, her hands folded tightly in front of her, avoiding my eyes in a way that hurt more than any accusation ever could. And I wanted to speak, to ask her what she thought was happening here, but the words never came because the room itself felt arranged against me. When the lawyer, Richard Caldwell, finally began speaking, his voice carried that careful professional tone used when truth is about to be reduced into paperwork, and he said the estate of Laura Harrison would now be distributed according to her final trust agreement. And that is when Daniel leaned back and whispered just loud enough for me to hear, $8 million, Michael. She did well. We did well. And I remember thinking how strange it was that he used the word we while looking at everything my wife had built as if I were already removed from the equation. Then the lawyer paused, not for drama, but for clarification, and he reached under the table and placed a folded coat on top of the documents. Old, beige, worn at the edges, something so ordinary that a few people actually shifted in their seats as if confused why it was even there. And Daniel chuckled under his breath and said, "This is it? Seriously? A coat?" And someone else in the room laughed softly, the kind of laughter that comes when people assume a man has been reduced to nothing and it is safe to dismiss him. But I did not laugh, because I knew that coat. I had seen Laura keep it closer than anything else in her final months. I had watched her fingers trace its seams as if she was remembering something no one else could see. And when the lawyer's hand hesitated just slightly before touching it again, I noticed something in his expression that did not belong to procedure. He looked uncertain, almost careful, like a man standing too close to a truth he had been instructed not to misread. And that was the first moment I felt something shift in my chest, not hope exactly, but recognition that what I was being shown was not the full story. And as Daniel leaned forward again, ready to dismiss it, the lawyer finally spoke a sentence that changed the temperature of the entire room, saying, "Before we proceed, there is something unusual stitched inside this garment that was not listed in any summary of assets." And in that moment, every sound in the courthouse seemed to disappear, and I realized that whatever Laura had left behind was not meant to be understood quickly. And as the lawyer reached for a seam on the inside of the coat and gently pressed his fingers against it, he stopped, looked up at me directly, and said quietly, "Mr. Harrison, I think you should see this yourself." And that was when I understood that whatever truth my wife had buried inside that old coat had already begun to wake up. Before that courtroom in Cuyahoga County, before the coat was even placed on the table, there was a version of my life that still felt warm enough to survive memory. And when I think about Laura Harrison, I do not think about illness or endings first. I think about a hospital corridor in Cleveland that smelled faintly of disinfectant and coffee that had been sitting too long in a paper cup. I think about the sound of wheels rolling slowly across tile floors. And I think about the moment she looked up from a chart and saw me for the first time, as if I was not just another patient passing through, but someone she had already decided to pay attention to. She was not supposed to be part of my life. She was a visiting nurse assigned after a minor industrial accident I had at the time. Nothing dramatic, nothing that should have changed anything. But she walked into that room and said, "You are not breathing correctly," as if it was the most obvious truth in the world. And I remember laughing softly because no one had ever spoken to me that directly without trying to sell me something or dismiss me entirely. I told her, "I have been breathing just fine for 60 years. And she responded without smiling, "That is exactly what I am worried about." And something in the simplicity of that answer stayed with me longer than it should have, because it was the first time in years someone spoke to me like I still mattered in a system that was not already finished with me. Later, she would bring me water without being asked, check my pulse twice even when the monitors said I was stable, and sit quietly in the corner of the room doing paperwork while occasionally glancing up as if she refused to leave me alone with my own silence. And one afternoon, I asked her why she kept doing that, and she said, "Because people like you stop asking for help long before they actually stop needing it." And I remember staring at her because I did not know how she had read me so accurately in such a short amount of time. After I was discharged, I thought that would be the end of it. Hospitals are like that. They take pieces of you and return you to the world as if nothing happened. But 2 weeks later, she called me, not for a medical reason, just to check if I had eaten properly. And I remember holding the phone in my kitchen in Rocky River, Ohio, unsure of why I was suddenly more nervous than I had been in any meeting or negotiation in my entire working life. I asked her, "Is this part of your job?" And she said, "No, it is part of my judgment." And she laughed quietly after that, like she knew I was trying to find rules to something that did not follow any. We began meeting for coffee at a small place near Lakewood, where the chairs were always slightly uneven and the sugar packets never matched. And we talked about ordinary things at first, weather in Ohio that never quite committed to being predictable, the way Lake Erie changed color depending on mood more than season, and the small frustrations of aging in a world that moves faster than your joints are willing to allow. But slowly, those conversations became something else. I started waiting for them without admitting I was waiting, and she started noticing when I was late by even 5 minutes. And one evening in late November, she looked at me across a table near a fogged window and said, "You are always preparing to leave even when you are sitting still." And I told her, "That is not true." But she simply nodded like she was not arguing with me, just observing me. And that was the beginning of how she loved me. Not loudly, not dramatically, but like someone carefully restoring something they were not sure they were allowed to touch. Years later, when we married, it was not the kind of wedding people remember for size or celebration. It was small, almost private, held in a courthouse chapel with light coming in through tall windows that made everything feel temporarily forgiven. Emily stood beside me, already grown but still carrying the distance that had formed between us without either of us fully admitting when it started. And Daniel was not yet the center of anything in our lives, just someone polite, present, and observant, though even then Laura watched him longer than most people did, not with suspicion exactly, but with the kind of attention that suggests she was reading a paragraph others were skipping. After the wedding, life did not suddenly become easy. That is something people misunderstand about second chances. They think it rewrites everything, but most days still felt like ordinary maintenance. Bills, silence, weather reports, and dinners where conversation had to be gently encouraged into existence. And over time, I noticed something subtle. Laura began asking questions about financial details that I had previously ignored, not because she was worried about money, but because she trusted patterns more than appearances. Who has access to the accounts? She asked once while washing dishes, and I told her Daniel was helping with organization since Emily was busy, and she paused just long enough for me to notice before saying, helping and controlling are not the same thing, Michael. And I remember feeling slightly irritated because I did not want complexity in my home. I wanted peace. But she never raised her voice. She never accused. She simply observed and stored information the way someone collects weather data before a storm. There were moments when Emily would call and the tone would change halfway through the conversation depending on who was near her, moments when visits felt shorter each time even though no one admitted to leaving early, and moments when I found myself speaking less because it seemed easier than explaining what I could not yet prove. And Laura would notice all of it without commenting immediately, until one night she placed a folder on the kitchen table in silence and said, "If I ever stop being able to speak for myself, do not let them speak for me." And I asked her what she meant, but she only looked at me for a long moment and said, "I am not guessing, Michael, I am preparing." And I did not fully understand that sentence at the time, not the weight of it, not the foresight behind it, not the years of quiet calculation it contained. I only understood later, much later, that the woman I thought I was simply sharing a life with had been watching our entire family like a system that required protection against its own instability. And now, sitting in that courthouse years later, hearing her absence translated into paperwork and inheritance and silence, I began to realize that the coat on that table was never just fabric. It was the final place where she had decided to hide everything she could not safely say out loud. And the more I remembered her eyes in those final years, the more I felt a question forming that I could not yet answer. Because if Laura had truly planned everything so carefully, then the only thing left to wonder was not what she left behind, but what she had been protecting me from all along. And that thought stayed with me as the lawyer's hand hovered again over the seam of the coat, and for the first time since I entered that room, I felt the uneasy sense that I was not about to discover something new, but something that had been waiting for me to finally be ready to see it. The moment the lawyer's fingers hovered over the seam of the coat, the air inside the probate room felt tighter, as if the walls themselves were waiting for permission to speak. And I remember Daniel Whitmore shifting in his chair with a kind of impatient confidence that had followed him into every room he believed he already owned. He let out a short breath and said, "This is ridiculous. We are treating an old piece of clothing like it has legal significance." And then he leaned back, turning slightly toward Emily as if to recruit her agreement, but she did not answer him immediately. Her eyes stayed on the coat in a way I had not seen before. Not curiosity exactly, but something more unsettled, something that looked like doubt forming too late to be comfortable. Daniel continued, his voice sharper now. "Laura was not thinking clearly at the end. We all know that. This is sentimental nonsense, not an estate plan." And I felt something inside me tighten because the way he spoke her name made it sound like she had already been reduced to a mistake rather than a person. The lawyer, Richard Caldwell, did not respond right away. He simply adjusted his glasses and looked at the coat again, carefully, as if he was reading something invisible to everyone else in the room. Daniel stood up slowly at that point, not in anger, but in control, the kind of control people use when they believe procedure belongs to them. He walked closer to the table and tapped lightly on the edge near the coat. "Let us finish this properly. I have meetings in downtown Cleveland," he said, as if grief itself should respect his schedule. And then he added, almost casually, "Michael, you should sit down. This is not your area of understanding." And that was when he finally turned directly to me, not with rage, but with dismissal. And I realized something in that moment. It was not that he hated me. It was that he had already decided I was irrelevant, like a document already archived, no longer worth reading. I remember hearing the faint sound of paper shifting as the lawyer opened the folder again, but my attention stayed on Daniel because he had stepped closer to the coat now, close enough to reach it without asking. And I saw his hand move in a way that suggested he was about to fold it away, remove it, reduce it to an object that no longer needed explanation. And he said quietly, "We can donate this after, if that is what everyone agrees." And then he reached for the fabric. That was the exact moment everything changed. Because as his fingers touched the inside lining, there was a small resistance, not dramatic, not loud, just enough for him to pause and frown. "What is this?" he muttered, pulling slightly, and the lawyer's head lifted immediately, faster than before. "Do not," he said. But it was already too late. Daniel had already found the hidden seam, and with a motion that was more frustration than intention, he pulled it open just enough for something thin and folded to shift inside. The room went silent in a way that was not emotional, but alert, like every person had instinctively stopped breathing at the same time. Emily stood up halfway from her chair. "Daniel, stop," she said. But her voice was uncertain, and that uncertainty mattered more than her words, because it was the first time she had not supported him automatically. Daniel froze for only a second, then scoffed softly. "It is nothing, probably old fabric padding," but the lawyer had already stepped forward now, his tone completely different. "Sir, I need you to step back," he said firmly. And that shift in authority changed everything in the room. Daniel looked at him with annoyance. "Are you seriously telling me a coat has become evidence?" he asked. But before anyone could answer, the seam that he had opened revealed a second layer, and inside it something white slipped partially into view. Folded paper, aged but carefully preserved. My breath slowed without my permission, because I recognized immediately that this was not random. This was deliberate concealment. Laura did not do anything without reason. Daniel reached again, slower this time, almost skeptical, and pulled the folded item free. It was sealed, not with modern adhesive, but with an old wax imprint that carried a faint symbol I had seen once before in Laura's private notebook, a symbol she never explained to me. And when Daniel saw it, he hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, then laughed lightly as if to regain control of the room. "A letter? Seriously, this is what we are doing now," he said. But his voice had changed, less confident, more defensive, and that is when the lawyer spoke again, quieter this time. "That seal belongs to a private legal instruction filed outside the primary trust." And those words landed differently, because they were not emotional, they were procedural. They carried weight in a way opinions never could. Emily stepped fully into the space now, her voice low. "Outside the trust," she repeated, and I could hear the shift in her understanding, like something structural inside her assumptions had just cracked. Daniel finally broke the seal with his thumb, not carefully, not respectfully, but with impatience, and as the wax separated, a folded letter dropped slightly into his hand, and in that instant I saw something I did not expect. His confidence did not disappear, but it paused, like a machine briefly losing synchronization. The lawyer extended his hand immediately. "I need to read that aloud," he said. But Daniel did not move yet. He just stared at the paper as if it had suddenly stopped belonging to him. And then, almost too quietly to be heard, he said, "She really did not trust anyone." And for the first time since this entire process began, there was no smile on his face, only a recognition he was not ready to name. And as the lawyer reached forward and took the letter from his hand, I realized with a sinking clarity that whatever Laura had written inside that coat was not meant to be discovered slowly. It was meant to be triggered exactly like this, by the wrong hands touching it at the wrong moment. And when the lawyer unfolded the first page and stopped mid-breath, I saw his expression change in a way that made the entire room feel suddenly smaller. Because whatever was written there was not just a message, it was a correction, and I understood then that the real inheritance had not even begun to reveal itself yet. "No other than Callan Kynett Prost." Then Cuyahoga County Probate Chamber understood that something irreversible had just begun. The lawyer still held the unfolded letter in his hand, but he was no longer reading it. His eyes had shifted slightly upward, past the paper, past Daniel Whitmore, past everything that had been assumed to matter in that room. And I noticed it before anyone spoke, that subtle change in focus that happens when a person recognizes not the document, but the consequence of it. Then the door at the side of the courtroom opened quietly, not with drama, not with force, but with the calm certainty of someone who was never unsure about whether they belonged there. A man stepped in slowly. Late 60s, dark navy suit, silver hair neatly combed, carrying no briefcase, no urgency, only presence. And for a moment nobody reacted because people like him do not announce themselves. They simply rearrange the atmosphere around them. He paused near the back row, scanned the room once, and then his eyes stopped on me, not on the coat, not on the lawyer, not on the inheritance documents, but directly on me, and I saw something shift across his face that I did not expect. Recognition, not casual recognition, but the kind that carries memory, responsibility, and surprise all at once. He took one step forward and said my name, quietly at first, Michael Harrison, and the sound of it cut through the room sharper than anything Daniel had said all day. Daniel turned immediately, irritated, confused, ready to control the interruption. "Who is this?" he said. But the man ignored him completely, continuing to walk forward as if Daniel had not been granted relevance in that moment. The lawyer lowered the letter slightly, watching now with careful attention, and Emily straightened in her seat as if she suddenly felt the room tilting in a direction she did not understand. The man finally stopped near the front, just a few feet from the table where the coat lay open, and he looked at me again, longer this time, then said, "I have not seen you in over 20 years, but I would recognize your posture anywhere." And there was a pause, a long one, because everyone in that room was now trying to place him in a category that made sense: judge, attorney, witness, stranger. But none of those labels fit the way he carried himself. Daniel finally stepped closer, his voice sharper now. "Sir, this is a private probate proceeding. You cannot just walk in here." But the man finally turned his head slightly toward Daniel, just enough to acknowledge him without giving him authority, and said calmly, "I am aware of what this is," then turned back to me, and in a lower voice added, "Michael, do you remember the Naval Logistics Advisory Board in Norfolk? 1998. And I felt something inside me tighten because memory does not always arrive as images. Sometimes it arrives as weight, as recognition of decisions you made long ago that you did not realize were still moving through the world. I nodded slowly without speaking, and the man exhaled once, as if confirming something he had suspected. Then he said, "I am Judge Thomas Whitaker, retired United States federal magistrate. I presided over 3 procurement integrity hearings that your technical reports supported." The room changed immediately, not loudly, but structurally, because titles like that do not belong to interruptions. They belong to authority. Daniel let out a short laugh, nervous now, trying to reclaim control. "A judge. Fine. Then you understand procedure. This is an inheritance matter, not a reunion." But Judge Whitaker did not look at him. Instead, he reached into his inner jacket pocket slowly, carefully, and placed a folded document on the table beside the coat, untouched, deliberate, and said, "I understand procedure better than most people in this room, which is why I am here." Then he looked at the lawyer and added, "Richard, you may want to read what is inside that letter aloud. But before you do, you should confirm the second filing." The lawyer blinked once, then twice, and I saw something rare in his expression: hesitation, mixed with recognition of a name he had not expected to hear in this context. He opened a separate folder, flipped through several pages quickly, then stopped, his face tightening slightly. "There is a secondary trust instrument," he said quietly, almost to himself, and Daniel's posture changed immediately, not collapsing, but recalibrating, like someone realizing the floor beneath them had been measured incorrectly. Emily leaned forward now, her voice barely audible. "What secondary trust?" And no one answered her right away, because Judge Whitaker was still looking at me. And when he finally spoke again, his voice was lower, almost personal. Michael Harrison was not just a consultant on those cases. He was the one who identified the accounting anomaly that prevented a federal misallocation of classified logistics funds. And the reason that matters here is because I have seen signatures like the one on that coat before. Daniel stepped forward again, but this time his confidence was thinner. "What does any of that have to do with my mother's will?" he asked. And Whitaker finally turned fully toward him and said, "Because your mother did not leave behind a simple will. She left behind a structured directive designed by someone who understands how people behave when they believe they have already won." And the word "won" landed differently now, heavier, less certain, and I felt my own past begin to shift under the weight of what was being implied, because I had never told my family about those years in detail, not because they were secret, but because they were never understood as anything other than work. Yet here was a man from that world standing in a probate courtroom in Ohio, confirming that Laura had known more about my past than I had ever explained aloud. And as he glanced once more at the coat, then back at the letter in the lawyer's hand, he said something that changed the temperature of the entire room again, quietly, deliberately. "If that seal has been broken, then what happens next is not distribution, it is activation." And in that moment I realized that whatever Laura had placed inside that old coat was not a memory. It was a trigger, and more importantly, someone in this room had just confirmed that it was already too late to pretend otherwise. The moment Judge Whitaker finished speaking, The word activation did not leave the room. It stayed inside it like something heavy that had found the right place to land. And I could feel every pair of eyes slowly shifting toward me in a way that was different from before. Not judgment anymore, but recalculation, as if people were suddenly trying to solve a version of me they had never bothered to understand. Daniel Whitmore was the first to break the silence, but his voice had changed, less certain now. "This is ridiculous. You are turning a simple inheritance reading into some kind of intelligence story," he said, forcing a small laugh that did not belong in that room anymore. But Judge Whitaker did not respond to him. Instead, he took one step closer to the table and looked directly at the lawyer. "Richard, read the secondary instruction," he said, and the lawyer hesitated for the first time since this entire process began, not out of confusion, but out of recognition that whatever was in front of him had moved beyond standard probate procedure. Emily's hands tightened together in her lap, and she looked at me as if she was trying to find something familiar in a version of me she had never been taught to see. I did not speak, because I was still trying to understand why a retired federal magistrate was standing in a county courtroom in Ohio speaking about my past like it belonged to a separate system entirely. The lawyer finally unfolded the second document, his voice lowering as he began to read. "This instruction is attached to the physical item designated as personal property, Coat Number 1, and may only be executed upon confirmation of sealed condition breach." And Daniel interrupted immediately. "What sealed condition? This is just fabric." But his tone no longer carried certainty, it carried pressure. "Like someone trying to push reality back into place," the lawyer continued. Slower now. "If the inner seal is accessed before the testator's passing conditions are fully verified, then the secondary trust activation protocol shall commence." And the word protocol made the room feel colder, not emotionally, but structurally, as if we had stepped into a different category of law that most people in that room had never encountered. Judge Whitaker nodded once, quietly. "That is consistent with high-level estate protection structuring used in sensitive asset protection cases," he said, and I noticed Emily whisper under her breath, "Dad, what does that mean?" But she was not looking at Daniel when she said it. She was looking at me, and that shift mattered more than anything else so far. Because for the first time she was not reacting to authority, she was reacting to uncertainty. Daniel stepped closer to the table again, his voice rising slightly. "You are all acting like this is some classified operation. It is an inheritance. People die. They leave money. That is it." But even as he spoke, I could hear something underneath it, a need to simplify what was no longer simple. The lawyer turned another page, and then stopped, his eyes scanning a paragraph twice before he spoke again. "The secondary trust identifies Michael Harrison as the designated continuity beneficiary under conditions of financial misrepresentation or coercion of the primary estate holder during final medical vulnerability assessment," and the room went still again. But this time it was not confusion. It was recognition that something had just been named in legal language that none of us had fully understood until that moment. Daniel froze, just slightly, and then let out a short breath. "That is not possible. I handled all of her finances," he said quickly, but Judge Whitaker responded immediately, calmly. "That is exactly why this clause exists." And I felt something in my chest tighten because I realized I was no longer being discussed as a grieving husband. I was being discussed as a designated safeguard, a term I had never heard applied to myself. Emily finally stood up fully now, her voice shaking slightly. "Dad, did you know about this?" she asked Daniel. And for the first time, he did not answer immediately, which was an answer in itself. The lawyer cleared his throat and continued reading. "In the event of activation, all primary inheritance allocations are to be held in escrow pending independent verification of fiduciary conduct." And Daniel turned sharply toward him. "Escrow? You are saying I do not get anything," he said. And now his voice carried something closer to disbelief than anger. But the lawyer did not engage with emotion. He only continued, "Pending review of actions taken within 90 days prior to death of Laura Harrison, including but not limited to account access changes, signature authorization shifts, and beneficiary restructuring activity." And I noticed something subtle then. Judge Whitaker's expression changed, not toward me, but toward Daniel, as if he had just confirmed something he already suspected, and he said quietly, "You moved her accounts within the last 3 months, did you not?" And Daniel's silence lasted just long enough to become meaningful. Emily turned toward him immediately. "Daniel," she said, And this time her voice was not uncertain. It was searching, and I could see the beginning of something breaking inside her understanding. Daniel finally spoke, but his confidence was fractured. I was protecting her assets. She was declining. She needed help managing things. But even as he said it, it sounded less like explanation and more like justification. Judge Whitaker shook his head slightly. Protection and substitution of control are not the same under fiduciary law, he said, and the way he said it made it clear this was not opinion, it was experience. The lawyer lowered the document slightly and looked at me again, and for the first time his voice softened. Mr. Harrison, your wife was not uncertain when she wrote this, he said. She was precise, and I felt something shift inside me because I suddenly understood that Laura had not been reacting to chaos. She had been documenting it. Emily sat down slowly, as if the chair beneath her had become unfamiliar, and she whispered, Mom never told me any of this, and I believed her, because Laura did not speak loudly when she prepared for truth. She constructed it quietly, and Daniel finally looked at me directly. Not with anger now, but with something closer to disbelief turning into fear. What did she know that I did not? He asked, not to the room, but to me, and I did not answer immediately because I was still processing the fact that I might not have known my own life as well as I thought. And then Judge Whitaker spoke again, his voice lower than before, enough for her to prepare for exactly this moment, he said, and as those words settled, I realized the room was no longer waiting for inheritance to be read. It was waiting for truth to finish revealing itself. And when the lawyer slowly placed the letter back on the table beside the coat, I noticed something I had missed before. The seal was not just broken, it had been intentionally designed to break under pressure, as if Laura had known that the real moment of discovery would not come gently, but in the presence of people who believed they had already won. The room did not erupt, it shifted, slowly, like a structure realizing it had been built on assumptions that were no longer stable, and in that silence I could feel something I had not felt earlier in the courtroom, not confusion, not grief, but a quiet alignment between truth and timing, as if everything Laura had prepared was now finally meeting the moment it was designed for. Daniel Whitmore was the first to move, not physically at first, but emotionally, his confidence breaking into something sharper, something reactive. This is insane, he said, his voice rising just enough to fill the space. You are all acting like a piece of paper and a coat are controlling $8 million. He turned toward the lawyer immediately. Richard, tell me this is not real. Tell me this is not enforceable. But Richard Caldwell did not answer right away. Because lawyers do not answer panic with comfort, they answer it with verification, and I watched him reread the clause again, slower now, as if repetition might soften its meaning. But it did not. Judge Whitaker stepped forward slightly, his hands still behind his back, calm in a way that made the tension around him more visible. And he said quietly, it is enforceable if it was properly executed under trust law. And from what I am seeing, it was. Daniel let out a short laugh. But it was hollow now. No, this is being misinterpreted. Laura was ill, she was being influenced. She did not understand what she was signing. And as soon as those words left his mouth, Emily flinched slightly, because it was the first time he had openly framed her mother as incapable rather than absent. I did not respond. I simply looked at the letter resting on the table beside the coat, because I had begun to understand something Daniel had not yet accepted. Laura did not leave confusion behind. She left structure. The lawyer finally spoke again, his tone now fully formal. The document does not rely on mental capacity assumption, it relies on recorded fiduciary behavior. And that phrase changed the air again. Because it removed emotion from the argument entirely, Daniel shook his head harder now. Fiduciary behavior. I handled everything for her. I paid every bill. I organized every account. I protected her from mistakes. His voice cracked slightly on the last word. And that crack mattered more than his volume, because it revealed pressure beneath control. Judge Whitaker turned his head slightly toward him. Protected from whom? He asked simply, and Daniel paused for half a second too long before answering. From confusion, from financial exploitation, from herself. But even as he said it, his eyes flicked toward Emily as if looking for support that was not coming. I finally spoke then, not loudly, not emotionally, just clearly. Laura never confused her finances, I said, and the room tightened again, because it was the first direct statement I had made since this began. Daniel turned toward me immediately. You do not understand what was happening in our home, he said quickly. You were not there every day. You were not managing her medications, her appointments, her accounts, and I nodded once, slowly, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. That is correct, I said. And then I continued. I was not managing her accounts, but I did notice when access changed without discussion, and that sentence landed differently, because it was not accusation, it was observation. Emily looked between us now, her voice quiet but unstable. What are you saying? She asked me, and for the first time I turned slightly toward her, not toward Daniel, and I said, I am saying your mother made changes I did not initiate, and I asked her about them. Daniel immediately interrupted. Of course you asked her. You were always paranoid about paperwork. But I did not react to the insult. I continued calmly, because calm is sometimes more disruptive than anger. She told me she was organizing things for clarity, I said. But she also told me something else. The room went quieter again, because now even Daniel stopped speaking, waiting, resisting, and I remembered that moment clearly, not as emotion, but as detail. Laura standing by the kitchen counter in Cleveland, holding a glass of water she never drank, looking out toward the backyard as if she was speaking more to time than to me, and she had said, if anything ever feels too simple, it is because someone else has already simplified it for you. I repeated that sentence in the courtroom, and I watched Daniel's expression change, not into understanding, but into resistance. That is not true, he said quickly. She never said anything like that. You are misremembering. And that was when Judge Whitaker stepped in again, his voice lower now, but firmer. Memory is not the issue here. Documentation is, he said. And then he looked at the lawyer. Proceed with the financial restriction clause. Richard Caldwell hesitated, then turned another page, and what he read next did not sound like inheritance at all. It sounded like containment. All accounts associated with Laura Harrison's estate shall remain frozen pending independent forensic review of transactions initiated within 120 days prior to death. And Daniel finally lost the rhythm he had been holding on to. Frozen. That is not possible. I have obligations. I have already made commitments based on those funds, he said. And for the first time his voice carried something close to urgency rather than authority. Emily stood up again, slowly this time, and looked directly at him. What commitments? She asked. And Daniel did not answer immediately, and that silence created a gap that no longer felt controllable. The lawyer continued reading. Any attempt to redirect, reassign, or prematurely access restricted assets shall be considered a breach of fiduciary oversight conditions established by the secondary trust. Daniel stepped back slightly now, not physically retreating, but psychologically, as if the floor under his certainty had finally given way. This is targeted, he said suddenly, pointing toward me. This is all pointed at me. He is trying to rewrite reality, but his accusation had no direction anymore. It was scattering. Judge Whitaker shook his head once. No one is rewriting reality, he said calmly. We are reading what was already written. And then he added something that shifted everything again. And I have seen enough of these structures to recognize intent. Daniel turned toward him sharply. What intent? He asked. And Whitaker replied without hesitation, to prevent control from being mistaken for care. And the room fell into a deeper silence after that, because even Daniel had no immediate response to it. I finally looked at him directly then, not with anger, not with satisfaction, just with clarity. And I said, I did not accuse you of anything. And that confused him more than hostility would have, because there was nothing to fight back against, only truth being stated without emotion. And I continued. Laura did not design this to punish you. She designed it to verify you. And for the first time, Daniel did not interrupt. He simply stood there, looking at the table, the coat, the letter, and the lawyer who was now waiting for the next instruction. And in that moment I realized the most important shift had already happened, not in the documents, not in the money, but in perception, because the story Daniel had been telling himself was no longer supported by the room around him. And as the lawyer prepared to continue reading the next clause, I understood that whatever came next would not be about loss or gain. It would be about exposure, and that realization alone was enough to change the way every breath in that courtroom sounded. The silence that followed the last reading was not empty. It was unstable, like a room holding too many truths at once without knowing which one would break first. And I could feel it in the way Daniel Whitmore kept shifting his weight, no longer standing like a man in control of a process, but like someone trying to stand inside a situation that was no longer listening to him. Emily had not spoken for several minutes now, and that silence was more meaningful than anything she had said earlier, because it no longer felt like uncertainty. It felt like observation. Judge Whitaker remained still near the back of the courtroom, his presence no longer disruptive but anchoring, and the lawyer, Richard Caldwell, held the letter as if it had begun to feel heavier than paper should be. Then he cleared his throat once, not for attention, but for structure, and said, "There is an additional clause that must now be executed in sequence with the secondary trust conditions." Daniel immediately turned toward him, his voice rising again, but thinner now. "No more clauses, no more surprises. Just tell us what this is." But the lawyer did not respond to emotion, only to instruction, and he continued reading. Clause 7, behavioral integrity, verification requirement. And I noticed something shift in Daniel's expression at the word behavioral, because legal language becomes more dangerous when it stops being financial and starts being personal. The lawyer paused briefly, then added, "All individuals identified as active participants in estate management during the final 120 days prior to death of Laura Harrison are subject to independent testimonial review." Emily frowned slightly. "Testimonial review," she repeated, and Daniel laughed once. But it was automatic, not confident. "This is absurd. Are we being audited like corporations now?" he said, but no one answered him. Because the structure of the room had already moved past his interpretation, Judge Whitaker stepped forward slightly and said calmly, "That is not uncommon in high-value estate disputes where control transition is contested prior to death." And Daniel immediately pointed at him, "You are not even part of this case. You just walked in here." But Whitaker did not react to the accusation. He only said, "I am part of this because I have seen the consequences of what happens when people believe silence equals consent." And then something unexpected happened. Emily turned toward Daniel, not toward me, and said quietly, "Why did you never tell me about any of this?" And that question landed differently than anything before it. Because it was not legal, it was relational, and Daniel blinked once, caught off guard. "Tell you what," he replied quickly, but his voice lacked rhythm now. Emily stepped forward slightly. "Any of it, the accounts, the changes, the trust structures, Mom's meetings with lawyers." And Daniel shook his head. "Because there was nothing to tell. I was handling things." But as he said it, his tone carried something defensive rather than factual, and I realized then that the conflict in the room was no longer about me or Laura. It was beginning to turn inward. The lawyer continued reading. "Testimonial review requires corroboration of fiduciary conduct by all named parties, including spouses, advisors, and delegated financial agents." And Daniel interrupted immediately, "I am not an agent. I am her son, in law." But the lawyer replied without hesitation, "You are listed in 2 account access authorizations within the last financial quarter of her life." And that sentence changed Daniel's posture instantly, not dramatically, but precisely, like a man realizing a door had been recorded opening that he did not expect to be visible. Emily turned toward him fully now. "You had access to her accounts," she said, and Daniel raised his hand slightly. "Only to help, only for payments," she asked me. But the way he said it sounded less like explanation and more like retrieval of justification. Judge Whitaker spoke again quietly. "Did she document those requests in writing?" And Daniel hesitated, just long enough for the absence of an answer to become an answer. And I watched Emily process that silence slowly, not emotionally yet, but structurally, as if she was rebuilding the timeline of her mother's final months in real time. The lawyer lowered the document slightly, then added, "There is also a recorded correspondence attached from Laura Harrison's private legal account confirming restricted authorization boundaries." Daniel stepped forward sharply. "That is not real. She never had a private legal account." But Whitaker responded immediately. "She did, established through counsel in Lakewood under confidential estate preservation guidelines." And for the first time, Daniel looked away from the lawyer and toward me, not in accusation anymore, but in something closer to disbelief, as if I was the variable he could no longer eliminate from the equation. And I did not move, because I was beginning to understand something I had not understood before, that Laura had not been reacting to people as they behaved. She had been documenting how they behaved when they thought no one was recording them. Emily finally spoke again, but her voice was lower now. "So what are you saying?" she asked. "Not to anyone specific." And Richard Caldwell answered, I am saying your mother created a layered verification system to distinguish between assistance and control. Daniel shook his head harder now. No, no. This is being twisted. She trusted me. She relied on me. But even as he said it, his certainty was breaking into repetition, and repetition is often the first sign of collapse. Judge Whitaker stepped closer to the table, looking at the code again, and said quietly, Trust is not what is being measured here. And then he looked directly at Daniel. Behavior under unmonitored authority is. And that phrase caused something in Daniel to snap from defense into reaction. You are all trying to turn me into a criminal, he said loudly, but no one responded, because the room was no longer debating character, it was reviewing structure. Emily turned fully toward him now, her voice shaking slightly but controlled. Did you ever move money without telling Mom? She asked. And Daniel opened his mouth, then closed it, then finally said. She did not need to be involved in every detail. And that was the moment the silence changed quality again, because involvement and exclusion are not the same thing in law, but they are indistinguishable in family. The lawyer looked down at the final page of the letter and said, There is one final instruction from Laura Harrison. And even Daniel stopped speaking, because final instructions are where truth stops being layered and becomes direct. And I felt it before it was spoken, that whatever came next would no longer be about interpretation. It would be about exposure. And as the lawyer prepared to read the last clause, I realized that the room was no longer waiting to understand what had happened. It was waiting to see who would still be standing when understanding was finished. The lawyer did not speak immediately after announcing the final instruction, and in that pause I felt something I had not expected to feel inside that courtroom. Not anticipation, not anger, not even curiosity, but exhaustion, a deep and quiet exhaustion that comes when truth stops feeling like something you chase and starts feeling like something you simply stand beside. Daniel Whitmore was no longer speaking at all. He stood in a way that suggested his confidence had finally run out of places to stand. Emily remained frozen halfway between her seat and the realization that her understanding of her own family had been incomplete for a long time, and Judge Whitaker, who had entered this space like an interruption, now felt more like a witness to something he already knew would eventually surface. The lawyer unfolded the final page slowly, almost respectfully, and said, Final instruction from Laura Harrison. Then he paused again, not for effect, but because even he seemed to recognize that whatever came next would not simply distribute assets, it would rearrange relationships. I remember hearing the faint sound of the heating system in the courthouse, a low mechanical hum that suddenly felt louder than every human voice in the room. And then he began reading, To all parties present, if you are hearing this in a formal setting, then the conditions I anticipated have occurred. And those words did not feel like legal language. They felt like presence, like Laura was still guiding the room from somewhere just outside of it. This is not an instruction for division, the letter continued. It is an instruction for release. And I noticed Daniel exhale sharply, as if the word release carried a meaning he did not want applied to him. But the lawyer continued. To Michael Harrison, you were never intended to be measured by what remains, only by what continues when control is removed. And I felt something tighten in my chest, not pain, not grief, but recognition, because Laura had always spoken like that in quiet moments, as if she understood that people are rarely defined by what they own, but by what they refuse to become. Emily finally spoke, her voice fragile. Mom wrote this, she said softly, as if confirming it out loud made it more real. And I nodded slightly, not because I needed to, but because there was no longer anything in me that required resistance. The lawyer went on. To my daughter, Emily Harrison, I did not ask you to choose between people, I asked you to eventually see them clearly. And Emily covered her mouth with her hand for a moment, not crying loudly, just absorbing. And I realized then that Laura had not written this to punish anyone. She had written it to end confusion. The lawyer turned the page one final time, though there was nothing left beneath it, and said, All financial restrictions will remain in place only until the completion of independent review, after which allocations will reflect verified conduct rather than assumed loyalty. Daniel finally spoke again, but his voice was no longer commanding. It was fractured. So it is not over, he said. And no one answered him, because it was not a question that required agreement. It was a realization that required acceptance. Judge Whitaker stepped forward slightly, and for the first time his tone softened, not legally, but personally. It is over in the way that matters. He said quietly, what remains is only consequence. And then he looked at me, not with authority, but with acknowledgement. And in that moment I understood that I was no longer being evaluated by systems I had never controlled. I was simply being recognized within one. Daniel looked at Emily as if searching for something that could restore balance, but she did not return that gaze immediately. Instead, she looked at the table, at the coat, at the letter, and then finally at me, and what I saw in her eyes was not betrayal, but displacement, the feeling of realizing you have been standing in a story you did not fully understand. I did not move toward Daniel. I did not speak to correct him. I did not turn toward the lawyer to ask for clarification, because something inside me had shifted away from confrontation entirely. I had spent years in rooms where outcomes mattered more than people, where decisions were measured in results and not relationships, and in that moment I understood that this was no longer one of those rooms. I slowly stepped back from the table, not as withdrawal, but as release, and I felt the weight I had been carrying for longer than I had admitted begin to loosen in ways I did not have language for. Daniel's voice rose slightly again. You are all acting like this is some moral judgment, he said, but his words lacked direction now, and I finally looked at him, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with something far more final than both. Neutrality, I said quietly, it is not a judgment. And I paused, because what came next mattered more than anything I had said before. It is a record, and the difference between those two things seemed to settle into him slowly, like something unavoidable but not dramatic. Emily took a small step toward me then, uncertain, her voice barely above a whisper. What happens now? She asked, and I realized she was not asking about money. She was asking about what kind of family remained after truth had been fully spoken. I looked at her for a long moment, and for the first time since this began, I did not see a courtroom. I did not see inheritance. I did not see conflict. I saw my daughter standing at the edge of an understanding she had not chosen but could no longer avoid, and I said softly, now you decide what kind of truth you can live with. And the room did not react, because there was nothing left to argue against, only space left to accept. I turned slightly toward the coat one last time, not as an object of mystery anymore, but as something completed, something that had done its work without needing recognition. And I understood then that Laura had not left me a victory. She had left me a way out of the war I did not realize I was still living inside. And as I stepped away from the table completely, I felt for the first time in years that I was not moving toward anything that needed winning. I was simply moving toward a quieter place where nothing had to be proven anymore, and that was when I knew that whatever came after this moment would no longer belong to the courtroom. It would belong to whatever kind of life I was still willing to choose. The courtroom did not feel the same after the last words were spoken, not because anything physically changed, but because something invisible had finally settled into place, like dust that had been suspended in the air for too long finally deciding where it belonged, and I remember standing there without moving. Not because I was frozen, but because for the first time in a very long time, there was nowhere inside me that needed to rush. The legal proceedings continued in the background, but they no longer felt like a storm, more like aftershocks of something that had already completed its most important work. Daniel Whitmore sat down slowly, not dramatically, not in defeat as people imagine in stories, but in a quieter collapse of certainty, the kind that does not announce itself. Emily remained standing for a moment longer, then slowly returned to her seat as if she was trying to understand whether the chair still belonged to the same version of her life she had entered this room with. Judge Whitaker eventually stepped back, his role no longer necessary in the way it had been moments earlier, and the lawyer Richard Caldwell carefully placed the documents back into the folder, as though even paper deserved respect after telling the truth it had been holding back for too long. What followed was not chaos, not celebration, but procedure, structured and unavoidable. The secondary trust conditions were formally acknowledged. The financial accounts were placed under legal hold pending full forensic review, and for the first time, the number $8 million no longer felt like a victory or a loss. It simply felt like responsibility being redirected toward truth rather than assumption. Daniel tried once more to speak, his voice lower now, less certain. This is going to be corrected. There has to be clarification. But no one responded immediately, because everyone in that room had begun to understand something he had not yet accepted. There was no correction coming, only confirmation, and confirmation is often heavier than judgment. I remember Emily finally turning toward me after a long silence. Her voice fragile, not accusatory, not defensive, just human. "Did you know any of this was possible?" she asked. And I took a moment before answering because honesty required me to separate what I knew from what I trusted. "No," I said quietly, "but I knew your mother would not leave things unresolved." And in that moment, I saw something in her expression soften. Not forgiveness yet, but recognition that not everything hidden is deception. Sometimes it is protection. Daniel left the room shortly after, not escorted, not confronted, just leaving as people do when they realize their influence no longer changes outcomes. There was no dramatic exit, only absence where certainty used to stand. In the days that followed, the legal process continued without spectacle. Financial institutions confirmed restrictions, advisors were questioned, records were reviewed, and slowly, the structure Laura had created revealed itself, not as punishment, but as precision, designed not to destroy anyone, but to prevent any single version of the truth from becoming absolute without verification. Emily called me 2 days later, her voice calmer, quieter, and she said something I did not expect. "I think I am starting to understand why she never explained everything." And I told her, understanding does not always arrive as comfort. Sometimes it arrives as clarity first. And she stayed silent for a moment before saying, "I do not want to be part of anything that requires blindness to feel secure." And I realized then that something in her had shifted permanently, not toward me, not against anyone, but toward awareness. Danielle, from what I later learned through legal correspondence, stepped away from financial oversight entirely, not through punishment, but through consequence. Relationships that had depended on assumed authority quietly dissolved under scrutiny that could no longer be avoided. Accounts were reorganized under independent trustees, and for the first time in years, no single person controlled the narrative of assets that had once defined family dynamics. But none of that felt like victory. It felt like correction, slow and uncomfortable, the kind that does not reward anyone, only restores balance. And in the middle of all of it, I found myself returning to ordinary things again, walking near Lake Erie in the early mornings when the air is still cold enough to remind you that the world existed before your worries did. I kept Laura's coat, not as a symbol of mystery anymore, but as something completed, something that had fulfilled its purpose. I placed it once on a chair in my home and simply looked at it for a long time, not searching for answers, but acknowledging that answers had already arrived, just not in the order I expected. Emily visited more often after everything settled, not out of obligation, but because distance no longer felt necessary to maintain clarity. And in those visits, we did not talk about inheritance or documents or courts. We talked about small things, weather, memory, silence, the way people change without realizing it until they are finally seen correctly. And slowly, carefully, something between us began to rebuild, not the old version of family, but a new one that required honesty more than proximity. Daniel's absence became part of the landscape rather than a wound that needed constant attention, and over time even that stopped feeling sharp. It simply became part of what had happened, what remained, and what no longer needed interpretation. There is something I want to say to anyone listening to this who has ever sat in a room where you felt misunderstood, underestimated, or quietly pushed aside without explanation. It does not always resolve in the way you imagine. Sometimes truth does not arrive as confrontation. Sometimes it arrives as structure revealing itself at the exact moment it needs to, and you realize you were never as powerless as you were told you were, only unrecognized by people who benefited from not seeing clearly. If this story reached you in a quiet place in your life, I want you to know you are not alone in that feeling. And nothing about being unseen means you are insignificant. It only means your story has not yet reached the moment where it is fully understood. Thank you for listening, sincerely, not as a narrator above you, but as someone who has learned that peace is not the absence of loss. It is the absence of distortion. If you found meaning in this story, feel free to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts below. And if you are comfortable, tell me where you are listening from and what time it is in your part of the world, because it still amazes me how far a single story can travel when it speaks to something quietly universal. The lesson I leave you with is simple and steady. Truth does not always arrive loudly, but it always arrives completely. And when it does, it asks you not to win, but to see clearly. There are more stories like this waiting for you in the next chapter. Stories about family, silence, inheritance, in the quiet moments where everything changes without warning, and I hope you will join me there when you are ready, because sometimes the next story is not about what happens to others, but about what you finally understand about yourself. Thank you for listening to this story.